What a year 1992 was. Not only was it the year that gave the world the likes of Super Mario Kart, Alone in the Dark, and Sonic the Hedgehog 2, but it was also the year that saw the birth of a couple of absolute legends. For clarity, I'm talking about myself and Ben Potter. Sadly, not everything gifted to us by 1992 was great, and so we're back yet again to remind you all of the very worst games that were released in that 12-month period. As always, a game is eligible for this list if it was released in at least one territory in the year 1992 and received a minimum of 7 professional reviews. Whilst we're here, we'd like to give a dishonourable mention to Home Alone 2 Lost in New York for the SNES, a game which is, in our opinion anyway, one of the worst that's ever been made, but that sadly didn't have enough reviews to qualify for a spot on this list. For shame, Home Alone 2, for shame. But without further ado, let's get to the qualifying dross. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are the 10 worst games of 1992. Number 10, The Duel Test Drive 2 SNES, 59.67%. Although you'd think that creating a racing game would be fairly straightforward, the number of times we've seen subpar driving titles on these lists leads us to suspect that it might not actually be all that easy. Whether it's janky mechanics, poor controls, or in the case of The Duel Test Drive 2, just being a bit dull, there are a plethora of issues that can prevent people from wanting to play a racing title. Like its predecessor, the focus of The Duel Test Drive 2, or Test Drive 2 The Duel if you want to get alternate title about this, was squarely on driving fancy cars along dangerous roads and trying to evade the police. In contrast to the original Test Drive though, Test Drive 2 gave players different gameplay modes and multiple different tracks which were situated in different parts of the USA. The main issue with The Duel Test Drive 2 was that it was just a bit bland. The graphics were okay for the time, but the environments all looked very similar, the cars were all functionally identical, and the excessive speeds displayed on the car's speedometers weren't properly conveyed to the players. Technically speaking, it worked fine, but Test Drive 2 committed the ultimate video game sin in that it was boring. Number 9, The Legend of Kyrandia, Book 1, PC, 57.5%. Point-and-click adventure titles have been around pretty much since the dawn of video game time, and if done successfully, they can provide players with several hours of puzzle-solving fun. On the flip side of things, games like The Legend of Kyrandia Book 1 probably just gave players a several-hour-long migraine. The game takes place in the Kingdom of Kyrandia, several years after King William and Queen Catherine, no, not those ones, are murdered by their court jester, Malcolm. The jester was imprisoned, but escapes after 18 years, steals a powerful magical artifact, and sets about causing chaos. The player takes on the role of Brandon, the king and queen's son, as he attempts to put an end to Malcolm's antics. The Legend of Kyrandia received some praise for its graphics, which were, at the time at least, a pretty solid effort. Unfortunately though, the pedestrian plot, often illogical puzzles, and infuriating interface left a sour taste in gamers' mouths. To be clear, no one element was completely awful, but they were all a bit mediocre and didn't gel together very well. Despite not being a particularly good game, The Legend of Kyrandia Book 1 still sold well enough to spawn not one, but 2 sequels, both of which achieved better review scores than the original. If at first you don't succeed, try again, I guess. Number 8, Lure of the Temptress, PC, 57.5%. We're going from one fairly disappointing point-and-click title to another now as we look at Lure of the Temptress, a PC title whose only allure was its option to exit the game. Lure of the Temptress tells the story of a peasant named Diamot, who through a series of blunders winds up trying to defeat an evil enchantress that's terrorizing the land. It's your classic tale of the underdog that stands up to tyranny, and it doesn't offer much new on the narrative front. In fairness to Lore of the Temptress, reviewers didn't hate it, but they certainly didn't love it either. It scored some points on the innovation front for endowing its NPCs with some degree of artificial intelligence, which allowed them to wander about the village and interact with each other, but it didn't gain much praise in any other department. Put simply, Lore of the Temptress was fine, but forgettable. The graphics and sound were okay, the puzzles weren't too convoluted, but they also weren't groundbreaking, and the gameplay was, on the whole, just a bit repetitive. Lore of the Temptress, more like Lore of the Mattress, right? Because it's the snooze fest and I want to go to sleep because it's really boring. Okay, that one's tenuous even for us. Number 7, The Terminator, Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis if you want to get American about this, 56.83%. Well, you knew there was going to be at least one movie tie-in at some point in this list, and it's a shame that 1992's terrible film-adjacent cash grab was spawned from such a fantastic movie. If you're not familiar with the 1984 action romp, it stars everyone's favourite Austrian bodybuilder, we've all got one, haven't we, Arnold Schwarzenegger, as the eponymous Terminator, a cyborg assassin sent back in time to kill Sarah Connor before she can give birth to a son that will one day save mankind from extinction. The video game had roughly the same premise, just without any of the fun. Though The Terminator did garner some praise for its dark, moody scenery, digitized stills from the movie, and futuristic soundtrack, critics didn't have many nice things to say about its gameplay. The platformer, which took place across several locations based on scenes from the film, was monotonous, repetitive, and had little to no replay value, and was also insultingly easy in places. This was in stark contrast to the Game Gear and Master System versions of the game, which players found to be way too difficult. God, there's just no pleasing some people, is there? The T-800 himself might threaten that he'll be back, but we certainly hope his awful video game won't be. Ha ha ha! Oh, good one. Number 6. Word Triss, SNES, 56.33%. In spite of how poorly it reviewed, we've kind of got to hand it to Word Triss for doing exactly what its title implied. It was Tetris, but with words instead of tetrominos. If only all games were named so succinctly. The premise was quite simple. The aim of the game was to build as many words of 3 letters or more as possible by using the letter tiles that fell from the top of the screen. Words could be built horizontally or vertically, and if players managed to construct the, quote, magic word at the top of the playing area, all tiles would be cleared, and they'd receive a massive Brucey bonus. In and of itself, Word Triss wasn't an awful game, it just had an awful title. Yeah, sorry writer, I disagree with you, it's not succinct, it's terrible. If you were into word puzzles, then this game wasn't a bad way to kill a few hours. However, the issue was that the game constantly drew comparison to Tetris, which was far simpler to understand and more accessible for a wider audience. It tried to combine the enjoyment of Tetris and Scrabble, but ended up capturing the fun of neither. It also gets a very low hypothetical review score from everyone here at Team TripleJump for all of the creepy clown imagery. Oh, who the heck thought this was a good idea? Number 5. Phalanx, SNES, 56.17%. It's a pretty poor showing when a game's box art is the most interesting thing about it. Many players probably bought Phalanx thinking they were getting hillbillies in space, which actually sounds pretty cool, but the game was just a straight-up space shooter, making the banjo-wielding chap on the cover a bit of a confusing choice, to be honest. Critics might have been able to forgive the bizarre box art had Phalanx had anything exciting to offer in either the plot or gameplay departments, but both turned out to be nothing special. Players take on the role of Wink Bowfield, a genetically enhanced pilot who is sent to the planet Delia 4, no, not that one, in order to reclaim it from the hostile alien forces that have taken over. In terms of gameplay, Phalanx gave players a very standard shoot-'em-up experience, with occasional doses of vexation. Some of the enemy tactics felt cheap and unfair, and forced players to replay levels again and again in order to learn their their attack patterns. Yes, games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring have done something similar with their enemies in recent years, but it seems that in 1992, the world wasn't really ready for such frustration. Number 4, Splatterhouse 2, Sega Mega Drive, 54.58%. If done well, the humble side-scrolling beat-em-up can provide players with tons of mindless fun. If done badly though, as was the case with Splatterhouse 2, they become exercises in monotony. The game is set a few months after the first Splatterhouse, and protagonist Rick is feeling guilty over the fact that he was unable to save his gal pal Jennifer. The terror mask, which Rick believed was destroyed, reappears to him and tells him that Jennifer can be saved. All he needs to do is seek out the titular Splatterhouse. Cue multiple monsties and grotesque villains. Critics struggled to find anything nice to say about Splatterhouse 2 though. Most found the graphics to be ugly, though not in the way one might appreciate in a horror game, and found little to love in the sound department either. Perhaps the nail in Splatterhouse 2's coffin though was the fact that it felt bloated by sections that players were forced to endure time and time again. The enemies were unfair, and Rick's attacks were often unsuited for tackling them. So although the game did have a lengthy runtime, this was only really because players ended up having to repeat levels to try and best the ridiculous monsters. Number 3, Rival Turf, SNES, 48.25%. We're sticking with naff beat-em-ups for the time being as we turn our attention to Rival Turf, a game with too many exclamation marks, one, and not enough substance. Rival Turf tells different stories depending on whether you purchased it in Japan or North America. The Western version stars Jack Flack, a man whose girlfriend is being kidnapped by Big Al and his street gang, and follows Flack and Officer Oswald Uzi Nelson as they attempt to rescue the unlucky lass. In the Japanese version, the protagonist is called Rick Norton, and it's his sister that's being kidnapped by an evil pharmaceutical company. Regardless of which version you played through though, Rival Turf wasn't very good. The premise was described as bland by a number of outlets, and the game's sound and music didn't fare much better. Perhaps the worst thing about Rival Turf though was the fact that it suffered from poor collision detection, which was frustrating at best and made the game downright unplayable at worst. The only thing that Rival Turf really had going for it was the fact that it had a two-player mode, where many similar titles didn't. Though considering that it was basically broken, all that meant was that players got to inflict it on their friends rather than having to suffer alone. Not really a selling point, is it? Number 2, Ernest Evans, Sega Mega Drive, 44.17%. Although he may look like a mullet-sporting Indiana Jones, we can't help but feel like a guy with a name like Ernest Evans would be more at home doing our taxes than he would scouring the world for treasure. Still, we could forgive a slightly daft name if the game behind it was worth playing. Sadly for Mr. Ernest Evans, his 1992 platformer was not worth playing. The game follows the eponymous protagonist as he sets out on a quest to retrieve a trio of ancient idols that possess enough power to bring about the end of the world. Naturally, he's not the only one on the hunt for the artifacts and must find them before Brady Tresider can get his hands on them and use them to destroy the Earth. As premises go, Ernest Evans didn't have a bad one, but it also didn't have the gameplay chops to live up to such an exciting story. The game was your standard platformer fare, but it suffered from very poor controls that made traversing the levels an absolute nightmare. It was a massive shame because the game looked and sounded quite nice, telling its story through a series of nicely designed anime-style cutscenes. Still, Ernest Evans was a video game, not a film, and so no amount of fancy graphics could save it from a rubbish review score. And number 1, Blazion, the bio-cyborg challenge, SNES, 42.25%. Ports can be tricky beasts at the best of times, and over the years we've seen more than our fair share of downright travesties. We'd like to say that Blazion the Bio-Cyborg Challenge is an example of a home console port done well, but if it was, it wouldn't be on this list, would it? Least of all number 1. The game is set in the midst of a war between the oppressive Imperial Earth Army and the rebel forces that oppose them. Players take on the role of a rebel pilot and must take part in a surprise attack on the Imperials. The arcade version of Blazion was received fairly well and quickly became one of the more popular games in Japanese arcades at the time. Sadly, the home port removed a great deal of the game's content, including a number of enemies, the animated opening, the ending, and 2-player co-op mode, leaving critics with little choice but to award it poor review scores. To make matters worse, what was there wasn't great either, as the SNES hardware struggled to keep up with the game. So congratulations to you, Blazion the Bio-Cyborg Challenge, on being the worst reviewed game of 1992. We just hope it brings you some comfort to know that despite this accolade, you're still not quite as bad as Home Alone 2 Lost in New York. Disgusting, isn't it? Just terrible.